What is up, New Beginnings Church? Happy Monday morning to you, and welcome to our devotional series. And this week we are doing something we have never done before. In the past, maybe I've had guests on or done combos, but this is the full-on week of Willard. I am with my friend Shane Willard. He decided to sit down with me. He's such an insightful person, so thoughtful. In my opinion, has just unbelievable insight into the scriptures. And I thought, well, if I can do devotions with Shane, that would just be amazing. And so he's going to sit down and join us for the whole week, maybe even a couple weeks. And one of the things I'm really excited about is this is what's so true about Shane. You should really go to shanewillardministries.org and then just buy everything. But one of the things that he was telling me that he's about to come out with is he's doing an updated version of a series that he has on the Lord's Prayer. And if you've never heard his stuff on the Lord's Prayer, it's amazing. And I'm sitting here thinking, that series was so good, what's he going to add to it? And so I thought it'd be so cool to hear from him this week on the Lord's Prayer. So again, the Lord's Prayer is something most of us are very familiar with. My funny story with the Lord's Prayer is simply this. One time I had to lead a congregation in doing the Lord's Prayer altogether, and I botched it. Like I messed it up. So anytime I think of the Lord's Prayer, I think I botched it. I totally messed that up. And so in light of that, man, what is your kind of newest insight on the Lord's Prayer, and what made you want to redo that series?
Well, first, just how revolutionary Jesus was being right at the beginning. So he says, when you pray, don't go on babbling like pagans do. They think they'll be heard because there are many words. Don't be like that. For don't you know your Father in heaven knows what you need before you ask? So right on the surface, he's like, look, the most basic thing, like don't be like pagans. And pagans, here's what sets pagans apart. Anyone who thinks God hears them because of their many words, right, is missing something. And anybody that thinks God hears them because they're loud about their needs is missing something. Now, that was pretty convicting to me because I thought, if you removed the words from my prayers and you removed the needs from my prayers, there's not a lot left. So at least on the surface, I thought I need to wrestle with this because, Jesus is telling me not to pray how I pray, and of course my only defense was, but that's how my church taught me to pray, right? Well, that doesn't really matter. If Jesus Christ is going, well, look, don't do this, and it's pretty basic. Don't make it about words and don't make it about needs. And there's some things we could look at in the Old Testament what he's referencing, but I want to share something with you that I thought Jesus is being so revolutionary. He's taking on the idea of an existent God, right? So he says, when you pray, just say this, my Father who is in heaven. Now, every God in Jesus' day existed. Christianity, Christians need to know this, but Christianity was birthed in a non-existent God. So Christians in the first century were killed by the Roman Empire, and the official charge was atheism. The reason is because when they asked, where does your God exist? Their response was, our God doesn't exist. And you could quote me on that. Anybody watching this can say, I know an atheist pastor, right? Or a pastor who doesn't think God exists. Any Christian that knows what they're talking about would say, yeah, God doesn't exist, because for something to exist, it has to be an object outside of you. So this chair exists, and it's here to serve me. If I can figure out how to make it serve me, it serves me. This cup exists. And that was every God in Jesus' day. Existent temples, existent objects, existent rituals. And then at some point, people did some existent thing that made that existent God then either act for them or not act for them. Jesus was like, nah, it's time for a new way to think about God. And he says, my supply, or my Father, who's as close to me as the air that I breathe. The word heaven there is Uranus, which is plural. If you're going to translate it heavens, you got to translate it heavens. But in most Hellenistic literature, it's translated air. So he says, my Father, who's as close to me as the air that I breathe. And the most basic thing going on there is if we start with God being existent, we have to do enough things to get that existent God to come serve us. But if we start with the idea that God is insistent or indwelling, which was the answer of the first century church, they said, where's your God exist? And they said, our God doesn't exist. He insists, or he indwells. And that changes everything, because an existent God can choose sides, can choose whites over blacks, male over female, rich over poor, but one indwelling spirit can't choose sides. And so Jesus' first step about understanding what God is like is seeing him not as existent, but rather one indwelling Christ holding the whole thing together. And that changes everything. My Father who's as close to me as the air that I breathe, that God, in other words, to Jesus, start where you're trying to finish. If you're doing all this, if you're doing all these words and screamings and rituals to try to get God to you, what if you just started with the understanding and the consciousness God's with you now? And that ends the existent God and welcomes in the concept of an insistent or indwelling spirit.
Does that like take me out of the idea of trying to imagine God as this singular being, usually an old white man with a beard,
yes,
maybe thunderbolts,
yes,
and reducing God down to my imagination?
Right, because in that, it's possible to have an orthodox doctrine, like I believe in God, even I believe in God as a relationship called Trinity, or perichoresis if you like the older word, but it's possible to have an orthodox doctrine, but a pagan imagination of how that doctrine works. So a lot of people have an orthodox doctrine, but when you ask them what do they picture when they pray, they picture Zeus, Apollo, Hermes, Mithra. And so it's in that sense, it's no different than the ancient Greek mythologies of existent gods. Jesus lived right in the middle of that world, and he's like, we're not playing that game. We're that's like climbing a ladder and realizing it's against the wrong wall. We're not doing that.
So if you could take that opening line of the Lord's Prayer and just take it into a summary statement, what would you say?
That God is as close to you as the air that you breathe, and that anytime you have more faith in your rituals to get to God than in God himself, you miss the point.
I love it. I love it. Church, that was amazing. Let's get back in here tomorrow. I love you so much. We'll see you then.